America now spends more money paying interest on its debt than it spends defending itself. Let that sit for a second. In fiscal year 2024, net interest on the federal debt pushed past $1 trillion by some official measures, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicaid, more than every dollar spent on veterans and education combined. And here is the part nobody puts on the evening news. The last three great powers that crossed that exact line, spending more to service old promises than to protect themselves, are no longer great powers. One of them no longer exists at all. But before you assume this is another video predicting the end of the dollar by next Tuesday, stop. It isn't. Because the $34 trillion number you've seen in every headline, the figure the national debt clock blew through in January 2024, the figure that has since climbed past $36 trillion, is, on its own, almost meaningless. A trillion is a scare word, not a measurement. The metric that actually killed empires was never the raw pile of debt. It was two ratios, debt against the size of the economy carrying it, and interest payments against the revenue available to make them. Every collapse in tonight's ledger turned on those two numbers, and by the end, you'll know exactly where the United States sits on both. The honest answer is more complicated, and frankly, more interesting, than either the doomers or the dismissers want you to hear. So let's open the case files. 4 empires, 4 ledgers, 1 pattern. Start with how the American pile was built, because no empire borrows $36 trillion by accident. It borrows it one emergency at a time. In 1980, the gross federal debt stood at roughly $908 billion, around 32% of GDP. Manageable. Then came 4 decades in which both parties, under presidents of every stripe, found reasons to spend more than they taxed. The Cold War buildup of the 80s, the brief surpluses of the late 90s. Yes, they actually happened from 1998 to 2001, erased by tax cuts. 2 wars after September 11th that the Congressional Budget Office and academic estimates place in the range of $4 to $8 trillion all in, and then the 2008 financial crisis, which added trillions more in bailouts, stimulus, and collapsed revenue. By 2019, the debt sat near $23 trillion. Then a pandemic arrived, and Washington, again, both parties, in near unanimous votes, borrowed roughly $5 trillion in under 2 years to keep the economy breathing. Add the quiet, relentless arithmetic of an aging population drawing Social Security and Medicare, and the pile compounds on its own. For most of that run, there was a trick that made it all feel free. Interest rates fell for 40 years. The 10-year Treasury yielded almost 16% in 1981. By 2020, it touched half of 1%. Washington was rolling over its debt at ever cheaper prices, like refinancing a mortgage every year into a lower rate, forever. Then, in 2022, inflation returned. The Federal Reserve raised rates at the fastest pace since the early 1980s, and the trick reversed. Suddenly, trillions in old, cheap debt began maturing and getting reissued at 4 and 5%. That, not the headline total, is why interest costs roughly doubled in 3 years. The pile didn't change character. The price of carrying it did. Now, every empire in tonight's files lived through that exact sequence. Cheap borrowing, an emergency, a rate shock, and then the moment the interest line crossed the wrong threshold. The first case file begins in the richest empire the world had ever seen, sitting on a literal mountain of silver. And it still went bankrupt, 4 times, under one king. Case file 1, Habsburg Spain, the empire on which the sun never set. A phrase coined for Spain long before Britain borrowed it. Picture the scene at Potosi, high in the Andes of what is now Bolivia in the 1570s. A mountain, the Cerro Rico, the rich hill, being hollowed out by tens of thousands of forced laborers. Mule trains and llama caravans winding down switchback trails, panniers heavy with silver bars, the metal cold and dull under the thin-air sun, bound for the coast, then the treasure fleets, then Seville. By some estimates, Potosi and the mines of Mexico supplied the great majority of the world's silver output in this era. No government in history had ever had a revenue stream like it, and it wasn't enough. Philip II inherited the throne in 1556 along with wars on three fronts: France, the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, and soon, a grinding, decades-long revolt in the Netherlands that historians sometimes call the 80 Years' War, and accountants might call the 80-year invoice. To fund it, the crown borrowed from Genoese and German banking houses through short-term, high-interest contracts called asientos. The silver was collateral, the wars were the expense, and the gap between them was permanent. In 1557, barely a year on the throne, Philip suspended payments, what we would today call a sovereign default, converting expensive short-term debt into long-term bonds at lower rates by royal decree, whether the bankers liked it or not. The Fugger banking dynasty of Augsburg, once the richest family in Europe, the house that had financed emperors, never fully recovered from Spain's defaults. Philip did it again in 1560, again in 1575, and that one mattered, because the Genoese bankers responded by cutting off the credit that paid Spain's army in Flanders. Within a year, unpaid Spanish troops mutinied and sacked Antwerp, the financial capital of Northern Europe, in days of killing and burning the Dutch still call the Spanish Fury. Contemporary accounts put the dead in the thousands. A default in Madrid burned a city in Flanders. That is what sovereign credit risk looked like before bond spreads. It looked like fire. The fourth suspension came in 1596. By the end of Philip's reign, debt service was consuming an enormous share of crown revenue. Modern historians estimate the debt had reached several times Castile's annual income, and some put servicing costs at well over half of revenue in the worst years. Read that again. The empire with the Silver Mountain spent more than half its income paying for money it had already spent. Spain remained a great power on paper for decades after, but the machine underneath was seized. The lesson of Case File 1 is brutal in its simplicity. Revenue, no matter how vast, cannot outrun compound interest plus permanent war. Potosi's silver flowed through Seville like water through open hands, and most of it landed in Genoa before the fleet was even unloaded, pre-pledged to creditors. Sound vaguely familiar? Today, roughly every fifth dollar the US government collects already belongs to bondholders before Congress votes on a single program. Case File 2 moves us to the gilded heart of 18th century Europe and the most consequential budget crisis in human history, the one that didn't just bankrupt a kingdom, but decapitated it. France, the 1780s, Versailles at the height of its glow. Candlelit galleries, the rustle of silk, a court that consumed fortunes nightly. And somewhere down the corridors, away from the mirrors, clerks hunched over ledgers by lamplight, dipping quills, carrying impossible numbers across page after page, looking for a column that balanced. There wasn't one. France had spent the century fighting Britain. The War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and then, fatefully, the American Revolution, which France bankrolled to the tune of well over $1 billion livres, largely on borrowed money, at interest rates roughly double what Britain paid. Why double? Because France had defaulted before, repeatedly, and lenders priced the memory. Britain, with its parliament-backed bonds and the Bank of England behind them, borrowed cheap. France borrowed dear. Credibility, it turns out, is the cheapest thing a government can own and the most expensive thing it can lose. By the late 1780s, the arithmetic was past saving. Finance Minister Jacques Necker's famous public accounting in 1781 had already massaged the numbers to hide the hole. By 1788, debt service was eating roughly half of all royal revenue. Some estimates push it higher. The Crown's response was a parade of finance ministers, Calonne, Brienne, each proposing tax reform, each blocked by the nobles and parlements who would have had to pay. Here's the warning sign worth underlining. France's crisis wasn't that the money didn't exist. France was the richest country in continental Europe. The crisis was that the political system could not agree on who would bear the cost. Every faction preferred stalemate to sacrifice. If that sentence gives you a flicker of recognition, debt ceiling standoffs, credit rating downgrades in 2011 and again in 2023 issued specifically over governance and brinkmanship rather than capacity to pay. That flicker is the point of this entire video. In August 1788, the royal treasury effectively ran dry and suspended payments. Louis XIII, out of options, summoned the Estates General, the old Representative Assembly, for the first time in 175 years, purely to authorize new taxes. It convened in May 1789. By June, it had declared itself a national assembly. By July, Paris stormed the Bastille. Within 4 years, the king who called the meeting to fix the budget had been executed by the government that meeting created. The French Revolution has 1,000 causes, but the trigger, the actual mechanism that forced the door open, was debt service. A budget line started it. Keep that in mind, because the third case file is the one that should unsettle Americans most. It's the only empire on this list whose money, like the dollar today, was the money of the entire world. Case File 3. Great Britain between the wars. In 1914, sterling was the global reserve currency, London was the planet's banker, and British debt stood at a comfortable level relative to its economy. Then came the First World War, which Britain financed with everything it had, and then the bill. By the early 1920s, British public debt had soared past 150% of GDP, and after years of grinding deflation and the Depression's onset, it climbed into the range of 170 to 180% and beyond by the early 1930s. Through the 1920s, interest on the war debt consumed an enormous slice of the budget. By several historical estimates, around 40% of central government spending in the worst years went to debt service. Britain was running primary surpluses, taxing hard and cutting harder just to stand still. The fatal choice came in 1925, when Britain returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war rate, a rate the economy could no longer support. It was a decision made for prestige to declare the empire unbroken. Keynes called it out at the time in a pamphlet aimed squarely at the chancellor who made the call. The overvalued pound strangled exports, deepened unemployment, and forced years of austerity that hollowed out the very credibility the rate was meant to project. Then, September 1931. Picture a Fleet Street newsroom on the night of Sunday the 20th. Telephones ringing off their cradles, copy boys, running galleys, editors tearing up the front page because the unthinkable had landed on the wire. His Majesty's government would suspend gold payments in the morning. The pound, the anchor of world finance for a century. The currency whose convertibility was treated less like policy and more like a law of nature, was cut loose. There had been a run. In the preceding weeks, the Bank of England bled gold reserves at a pace it could not survive, even after emergency loans from New York and Paris. A naval pay protest at Invergordon, sailors objecting to wage cuts, had spooked foreign holders into believing Britain itself was cracking. On September 21, 1931, Britain left gold. Sterling fell roughly 25% in short order. And here's the detail that matters for our modern question. The world did not end. Britain's economy actually began recovering before many gold bloc countries that clung on. But sterling's reign as the world's money was finished. The crown passed, slowly, then formally at Bretton Woods in 1944, to the dollar. Reserve currencies don't usually die in an explosion. They get quietly demoted, and the demotion gets recognized a decade later. One more file, the oldest in the cabinet because it shows the third way out. The one no spreadsheet flags until it's too late. Rome never had a bond market to default on. So when the empire's expenses outran its taxes, frontier legions, a swelling bureaucracy, emperors buying the army's loyalty with cash donatives, it paid its bills by quietly ruining its own money. Under Augustus, the silver denarius was better than 90% pure. Nero shaved it in 64 AD. By the reign of Gallienus, in the 260s, the coin that bore the emperor's proud silver profile contained, by most numismatic estimates, less than 5% silver, a bronze slug with a silver wash that wore off in your palm. Prices in the 3rd century rose by magnitudes. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 AD tried to outlaw inflation itself, prescribing death for overcharging, and failed within years. Romans went back to paying taxes in goods, grain, cloth, labor, because the state's own coin had stopped being worth collecting. An empire that debases its money doesn't default loudly. It defaults a little bit on everyone, every day, and calls it nothing at all. Modern economists have a politer term for the soft version of this: inflating away the debt, holding rates below inflation so old bonds quietly shrink in real terms. The United States did a version of it after World War II. It is not a fringe idea, it's a tool on the table, and history says it's the one empires reach for last and regret longest. 4 files then. Spain. Revenue can't outrun interest plus permanent war. France. The debt doesn't kill you. The political deadlock over who pays does. Britain. Reserve status buys time until one bad peg and one bad month end a century of supremacy. Rome. When you can't tax and won't default, you debase, and the rot spreads through every transaction in the empire. Now lay the American ledger on the same desk with the honesty the algorithm rarely rewards. Gross federal debt crossed $34 trillion in January 2024, passed $35 trillion in mid-2024, and topped $36 trillion before 2025. As a share of the economy, gross debt sits in the neighborhood of 120% of GDP, debt held by the public. The cleaner measure runs lower, near 100%. That's roughly where interwar Britain was heading, beyond where Ancien Regime France stood, and at the threshold the US itself last touched in 1946. Though that comparison cuts both ways, because America grew its way down from that peak. Net interest costs have crossed the $1 trillion line on some official measures and now exceed the defense budget. The statistic we opened with, and it is real, not rhetoric. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt held by the public climbing toward and past its all-time record share of GDP within the next decade if current law holds. Interest as a share of federal revenue is approaching levels, high teens, by some measures around 18 to 20 cents of every revenue dollar, that are historically loud, even if they remain far below Philip II's half or Bourbon France's half. And the counter case deserves equal airtime because a historian who only shows you the collapses is a salesman. The United States borrows in its own currency. Spain owed Genoese bankers. France owed rentiers it couldn't print for at first. The dollar is the reserve currency, meaning the world still queues up to hold American debt. Foreign and domestic demand at treasury auctions, whatever the wobbles, has not broken. And then there's the exhibit the doom genre never mentions: Japan. Japanese government gross debt has exceeded 200% of GDP, more than 250% at points, for many years, and Japan has not collapsed, not defaulted, not burned. Its bond market is quiet to the point of sedation. Reserve currency economies with credible institutions and their own printing press operate under different physics than a 16th century crown pledging next year's silver fleet. Different physics, but, the files suggest, not no physics. Britain had reserve status too. It bought her about 30 years past the point of no return. It did not buy her forever. So where does that leave the title of this video? Here, plainly. Every empire that reached this combination, triple-digit debt to GDP, interest crowding out core functions, and political deadlock over the budget, eventually lost its place at the top of the world's financial order. Not always through fire. Spain decayed across a century. Britain handed off the crown in conference rooms, not battlefields. Rome took 300 years to finish falling. The pattern in the files is not collapse next year. The pattern is the interest line crosses the defense line, the politics jam, and the empire starts paying for its past instead of its future. And from that point, the question is never whether the order changes, only how slowly and how managed the handoff is. History suggests a pattern. It does not schedule one. Anyone who gives you a date is selling something, and nothing in this video is financial advice. It's a ledger, read aloud. The open question, then, isn't whether 36 trillion is scary. It's whether the United States behaves like 1780s Versailles. Every faction, blocking every fix, waiting for an Estates General moment, or like the post-war America of 1946, which grew, inflated a little, and worked a 106% debt ratio down for 3 decades without a single default. Both paths are in the American ledger already. Which page comes next? Is being written right now in budget votes most people never watch. If tonight's files made you wonder what the actual mechanics of losing reserve currency status look like, how sterling's crown passed to the dollar step by step, and which warning lights flashed first, that's the story in the next video. The 1931 file goes deeper than one newsroom night, and the parallels get sharper the closer you look. The ledger stays open,